Hello everyone, today we talk again about the seigneurial system in post-Carolingian Europe that we are looking at pretty well, I must say, given the concentration in the last months of such topic in my videos, and more specifically at this time, the evolution, right, the transformation of the personal juridical condition de facto throughout all this time, especially in certain areas of Europe, as we will see now, which is probably what you don't expect from a time in which essentially the bases of feudalism were laid, and thus let's say, the margin of personal freedom would have seemed to be reduced, right? First of all, there is, of course, a margin of, let's say, an absolute and relative margin. That is to say, as we have observed many times, you can even lose part of your freedom in a certain period, but still becoming wealthier, for example, in the same, right? This is the history of the modern age by a certain degree. Not always, but let's say also the means through which you can get such goods can vary consistently. So I will not digress on this, because drawing comparisons between medieval modern eras is, somewhat complicated. At some point we'll probably do it, but at the same time, something similar to what occurred to the same milites, to the same nobility, the military aristocracy, at this point occurred in the lower classes, in a sense, because some areas, the same political fragmentation that the local seigneuries had brought about, fundamentally gave more opportunities to the serfs to essentially improve their own condition de facto, right? By also, acquiring a different status by moving, for example, in another seigneury. We have seen this for the 12th century in a video I made, I think, last month, where we saw how in the Ostsiedlung, for example, in northeastern Germany, in that case, it was normal during the colonization of the land for the local lord, lay or ecclesiastical alike, to say, okay, whoever comes here gains freedom. It's a freedom that we will grant, which is very interesting, because you understand at that point that your freedom still depended on this lord. In that case, it was a bishop, or a powerful one. But at the same time, it meant that if you could escape as a serf from your master's land to which you were tied to, not just, again, erase any kind of Marxistic, classistic interpretation of history that has no adherence to reality by any stretch of the imagination. It was always a contract, right? It was always a huge problem, especially in this time, to keep, in fact, and this is the same proof we're going to discuss today, the people under, right? Unless there were some other specific dynamics that would bring to that, because of course there were differences, again, in different areas of Europe. Paradoxically, in the early Middle Ages, there is an inversion of what was, in a sense, at the beginning of the period, right? With the areas that were historically more kind of dominated by this idea of freedom, or at least of a freedom or egalitarian status that still entailed slavery, right? Even a normal peasant normally owned some slave, became actually the ones that more hierarchically subjected to private seigneurial rule, whereas other areas that were habituated to live in conditions of factual serfdom in the latifundia, etc., over medieval times kind of passed to own, in part also because an important development of the entire system, or also some concentration of wealth at different political and social setting, their own freedom, right? To increase their own freedom and to make their land essentially a land of the free, really, by tradition. This is naturally by looking at the extremes, because still all the system was based everywhere in the concept that, of course, freedom is something that you had to earn as an individual, right? Juridically, if you were too weak or too poor, something, you couldn't also have the possibility of being a better person, and you would unavoidably, for your own interest, fall under somebody's protection that had to pay all the costs that derived from that as well, right? And that, there was an important cooperation in the same way, and again, this reflected the entire idea from which the world had come from since the beginning. I mean, the idea that every freedom and power is earned and it costs, and it's factually what you do that will determine what you get, right? And that's the only fair system that you can practically have by a certain degree, because the more you manage, the more skillful you have to become, the more qualitatively loaded in moral capacity you have to be. Otherwise, the thing collapses, and goodbye to that. And it's the case also of many seigneuries at this time that crumbled at a certain point because they didn't have the political and social possibility or capacity of sustaining themselves, right? And others were kind of more, they had more merit. But aside from this, we have made many videos about the seigneurial system. So this the emergence of essentially a private hierarchy that had simply filled the gaps and coexisted with instead the crumbled public authority, and that had remained in forms of, in fact, of kings and emperors, etc. Here we don't stress even in there how factually that same public authority, aside from the most statalized examples, especially one of the Roman Empire, was built ideally on the same basis of this, which this hierarchy was reforming from the bottom up after the disgregation of Carolingian Empire. So and again, it was in fact a matter of imperium. It was a matter of who had the faculty to rule, right? Which is a necessity, and you cannot say, well, let's just hope that somebody else comes here to help, that things will improve by themselves, because the second principle of thermodynamics is just to give a big slap in the face the second after, right? You have to empower yourself, knowing how to rule yourself also over other people, because fundamentally there will always be people that have not the palest idea of what the world is from a political, military, and social point of view for entrusting them any responsibility, or at least any relevant one. And you have to take matters in your own hands. So this system was naturally not perfect because it was an unruly system. Authority, discipline, order were a bit a chimera in a time which, in fact, it was not a superior authority that managed to gain enough consensus to rule practically. But at the same time, this was being built, again, from the bottom. And it took surely a long time before the system of the local seigneuries, local lordships, if you prefer, began to acquire solidity, right, and obliging to, say, achieve a minimum of discipline, even among the class of the milites, right? So those who were really called to rule by individual superiority, right, and thus provided with that kind of literacy of command. As again, the system was, first of all, extremely complicated and fragmented, so it was also very difficult objectively to make all the work to put a system together. We often ignore this politically and socially, again, from a physical point of view, how much it costs to put such huge systems together in terms properly of sheer energies and calories. So it took centuries before the feudal monarchies could emerge, right, and consolidate further to provide essentially the basis of the modern states as we know them. etc. And to thus instituting relatively correct relations with the population, because at the end of the day, again, it's the same old story. If you don't have the decisive, if you don't own the decisive majority of the moral support of the population, you cannot rule. There is no single government on earth that can afford to rule without the decisive moral support of the population. Right? This is like the ABC of any kind of historical understanding possible, morally and scientifically, and there is no other alternative. And this explains naturally why certain systems cannot work by definition, and others are just, blind, violent, lunatic utopias and other things. But an evolution in this sense was also solicited both by the experience that the castles owners, the fortresses owners acquired, as in parallel to the development by reciprocal imitation, their common plan, say, of coherent local domination, and also the parallel experience, again at the same time, that the peasants were making, even within the restricted, narrow area in which the seigneurial power could achieve them. And remember again that the peasantry in high medieval Europe had much greater power than it had in late medieval Europe. Right? There is no such thing like an improvement of the peasant condition, let's say, towards the Renaissance. It's completely the other way around. Right, and the reason is obviously the fact that at this point we're kind of not super states that could really frame again the communities within a more strict system. And again, this doesn't mean necessarily even that peasants lived in absolute terms better at this time than in later ones, as there is also no proof that in absolute terms they lived better like in the early Middle Ages, when they were freer even than the high Middle Ages, because being free again doesn't necessarily mean that you're free to live better, right? Or that you actually even know what to do with your freedom, especially when you don't know how to cooperate and to rule in the same way. So this is very debatable in many ways. Being out there with a plot of land in the wild and saying, this is the real way, a real man survives. It's an utter nightmarish reality where you can easily die from a moment to another, where there's no cooperation, there's not collective capacity to even absorb the losses, etc. You're just there on your own. You're going to make an atrocious effort individually, and even just to have something pretty lame. And you can eat more protein and fats, but let's say it's not necessarily going to to be better for you in practice as opposed to later times. In any case, these again are complicated parallelisms to trace. Not even historiography is really fully convinced of this, but at least the progressistic, it depends. Both the progressistic and the conservatistic ideas that are revolving around this are quite debatable, right? In some ways. Really bad the ones again that think that there was more freedom because more scientific knowledge came about, because there are two different things. The others, thinking, the more primitive, the better it was really for the individual. Really, there's no evidence for that either. And actually, people always try to improve their own condition, right? It's not a mere saying, okay, well, we're sitting here waiting that it goes wrong next time to do something about that. No, they tendentially think, and if they have means, they may have less pressure, but they will try to persecute this kind of common goal by putting stuff, in things that will hopefully work in the future. Anyhow, there is, and again, even the understanding of that, it's not directly proportional. You can have two different outcomes in that regard. So that's the counter argument as well. So this concept is interesting because you see, in Romano-Germanic times, there was, in theory, still an idea of a relatively uniform and organic protection throughout the entire territory of a realm of the interests of the landowners and of the population in general, and also of those masters whose escaping serfs were inexorably brought back to. For example, there is a famous law of the Longobard king Liutprand in 8th century Italy that already talks about this and says, essentially, serfs should not flee fundamentally from their masters because they're possession, right? And they were serfs because they had, especially at that point, fallen in that condition by something that they had failed about, right? They had committed a crime, they had lost all what they had indebted themselves, and for that reason, there was a very sound, logic behind the idea of owning a serf, which was something completely normal because, again, the freeman was considered per se as such a nobleman. That's why also the theoretically egalitarian idea of that certain peoples had in practice. This doesn't mean that there wouldn't be an aristocracy kind of oppressing the other freemen, but that's how essentially also these freemen had lost their own power because one way or another they had either accepted that loss of freedom for convenience because objectively it wasn't an easy time to live at all, or because of violence as well, because also external violence for that matter, and the disruption of the system, and so on. But the serf was also properly somebody who had degraded his own nobility, had committed these actions that had fundamentally proven in front of God that he hadn't been enough, right, to maintain his own freedom. And again, all the world was essentially a clientelary system. You can't really trace here. Here we are a bit obsessed in modern and secular terms by saying, okay, there is a divide. What's the standard of being a serf as opposed to something? That's not the point. It's not much about what determines a free or not free person, because there were different degrees of that, right? Even a king, in theory, had to be the superior of all, because he was the one that had the imperium, like the Roman emperor. Somebody gave it to him because he deserved that, because God had showed that he did. And the nobles were something, the common freemen were something else, the half freemen were something else, the serfs were something else, the slaves, in a sense, were something else. So this is complex and we can't explain it now, but the point I'm making is that there was a time, it was not very distant, because we make here, for example, a late example like the one of Liutprand, because the Longobard kingdom, as we repeated ad nauseam, was actually a very effective and efficient public system, especially in the 8th century, where really no other Latin Germanic country in Europe worked like that. But this was a bit the situation that had occurred, let's say, at some point back in the day, that maybe had never existed, right, in practice, as a idyllic kind of system. But in theory, you see, the Roman power all over the land was something enforced uniformly. The same Germanic kingdoms were created in the same way, same concept. And the land is ruled by the king entirely. So what is forming now in post-Carolingian times is that, again, a private system for which, even if you had wanted the king to, as it happened, right, to defend your rights, he couldn't, because he didn't have enough factual power, right? And this brought unavoidably say the kingdoms, as you know, even the empire kept existing, but the political practice, the judicial practice, was controlled by someone who had a limited territorial, let's say, whose government was of limited territorial extent. This is particularly important for a serf, and we will see how now, because while it's true that, for example, at the end of the 10th century, in a capitulary issued by Otto III in the Italic kingdom, the serfs are admonished not to contest their servile condition and being obliged to declare it, right, their own every year publicly on December the 1st, specifically, by paying a certain amount of money to the master as, in fact, the sign of servitude. The same capitulary is stating openly, is meaning by itself, I mean, that there was a difficulty of the local lords, especially the ecclesiastical ones, to maintain, to say, to constrain the servants that were wishing for liberty, right? And this naturally demonstrates the change occurred in the life of the countryside, where the seigneurial, say, coercive force had a too much of a limited reach of action. Mm-hmm. So what did happen? That a serf fleeing a territory can profit from the competition among the various lords and their need also of labor, human labor, and also military of manpower, properly for their men of masnata, as they were called. This is crucial, because you see that if in, I don't know, at the time of Liutprand, right, or a time where, I don't know, a Germanic kingdom in theory had a full public control on the country, or the Roman Empire was standing and could exercise its control on everyone, the reality would never quite be like this. There would always be, in practice in the ancient world, in any context, in any people, in every culture, the idea is that if you're not rich, you cannot defend yourself easily. That there is always, again, this clientelar relation, there is always this kind of dependence de facto, even if it's not sanctioned juridically. But in practice, also because of certain cultural standards, like those times were really harsher in terms of moral customs and so on. A servant, actually a slave, is not even a human being, right? You can't kill him, kill her whenever you want. You can do whatever the hell you want with them, because they do not figure juridically, right? They were called instrumenta vocalia in Latin, right? The animals were called instrumenta semi-vocalia, right? So that gives you an idea what the mindset was. And don't mind that, I don't know, in Northern Europe, the trials or anything were treated better. There is enough evidence to prove otherwise, right? It was a viciously violent, oppressive, abusive reality, as basically all the pre-industrial systems were, because we have studied them, were still there. Rape, abuse, incest, all the kind of misery you can imagine, especially in the lower classes. And this is, we're not talking about slaves, of course. This is a crucial point, because first of all, the same mechanism that brought some lords to acquire unprecedented power within the same realm, right? With feudalism, you have states within states that had never been seen before, right? At better, when a Germanic people settled, there were various clans that were still kind of, powerful locally, like the mob and whatever, but they, altogether, the royal power was in the best instances capable of still, also thanks to the, especially to the local, this is during post-Roman Europe, where there was still an administration, a bureaucracy, a literacy standing, and things worked because they had been worked more steadily before. There was a possibility really of controlling everything. There wouldn't really be anywhere we could flee, right? If you fled your master, the master could go to the king, or even just more easily to the local clan leader and say, look, this serf escaped. You are my protector, because de facto they already were. Like that's what the mob is like. And it had always been. And he would say, can you get me that slave back? And given that it was a functional establishment, this normally happened, right? The slave was caught and brought back, right? Or at least there was some good control on this. When everything crumbles into seigneuries, into lordships that are, very small, even just extensionally, and they're all fighting, competing, and, contracting with each other, you can imagine how easy it was for a serf just to escape into somebody else's lordship and say, look, do you need someone just to work better? And that, or to fight, and that worked, right? You would say, but why at this point wouldn't kind of that lord wanted you to be a serf? Well, because objectively not everybody was a serf, right? There was a quantity of people that you could just, the difference was being blurred, first of all, right? But this is exactly why the lords would use that condition to say, okay, I want you to be more, productive, and I can exploit you and squeeze you more. So the discriminant here is when the rural population, when the lords and the knights abandon themselves to intolerable collections or violence, and this is why different areas of Europe were different, when they were strong enough, they acquired an awareness of the possibilities of resisting, right? Not only where the movement of resistance is organized at the level of bishops and princes, but also through a direct pressure on the local power itself, right? So by the same peasants at the point, again, peasants were viciously violent and abusive and oppressive, right? The lower classes have always been some of the most radically fanatic and violent and senselessly evil elements of society. So don't let yourself be fooled here. These peasants were trying everything, right, to make their own seigneury in practice. And it was, again, rough, because lords were scared of peasants, right? Don't think that, again, especially at this time where the militia was, some kind of still embryonal phase of being defined in the 10th century, especially than in the 11th. It's not like in the 13th century where the feudal elite rules everything. It has an iron fist, etc. This is not even at that time everywhere, but still largely in Europe, and also because of what was happening instead in this 10th, 11th centuries in the different regions, right? They would be able to, they risk to be at some point sensibly weakened by the peasantry as well. It's just that the system was functionally standing also with that hierarchy. So again, it's not much about the role that the lifestyle that these individuals would have. Some would manage, to escape and becoming knights in the masnada of that lord. Maybe they were just servants, but they would achieve that freedom. It was recognized by their lords, and woe would touch them within that sphere, right, of that lordship. And maybe that was a good way also to go against another lord, whatever. But the majority of them were still peasant, and didn't have nor properly the aptitude or the mentality or the possibility, the capacity, of course, to be something else than peasantry, right? So this is normal for the overwhelming majority of the population quantitatively, right? Whereas a miles can keep under him lots of people because he has a technical value and skill and capacity and assets that simply, not even hundreds of peasants at a time can compare to in a disorganized way, right? Not really meaning that hundreds of peasants wouldn't manage to take down this guy if they had, but let's say the attitude and the functionalization of that society would make it. Why would I have disadvantageous for them to do it in the first place? Not because they fear to be defeated, but because there was still no other way to live at that point, even if they had killed that guy, right? So this thing of Italy is quite interesting because, first of all, speaking of Liutprand that we mentioned before, we made a video recently that was about the Longobards nobility and also the evolution from the ancient slavery to serfdom in the countries, in the Longobard countryside. That shows already this trend, which is quite interesting, specifically in the Italic kingdom. I have a Longobard history playlist. If you are interested, you can find it all there, but this one was more like social history. It's also in medieval society one. But here you see, we're studying them. Yeah, we arrived at Liutprand's time, and we didn't mention this thing of, the issue of the fact that a fleeing servant had to be brought back to his master. But there wasn't really much else. That tells you also how simpler society was, even compared to the one a few centuries later, right? Now again, this compression and fragmentation, paradoxically, at the same time, made all these people kind of squishing more easily in the system, in part. In other ways, again, it was still difficult, but considering the amount of violence, the increase of warfare, also of epidemics, of systemic disasters as well. You want to escape, because you see, if you are a serf and up to some point you're even glad you have a certain lord protecting you, but say there is a famine and you can't literally eat anything, there's nothing left, but still your lord insists that you are his servant and that there is nothing else you can do but keeping to work and starving to death. Well, you will gladly escape maybe to a lord that maybe is even it would treat you even worse, but still it would be easier for you at that point to go live in this land because not being struck by famine. And the reason is because it's all fragmented. Where is the authority, the overlordship that is going to bring you back? Right, unless those two lords do not go at war for each other, for you, which would also happen, by the way. Marriages were a huge issue in this regard, because there were peasants from different lordships that married each other, and normally, as you know, the woman went with a dowry, also in the land of the husband. So that's an important movement of women in this case, and that still contributes to the population because they will have children in that land, not in the other. So it's a huge issue also for the lords who rule that land in terms of manpower and demographics. So it's a mess, right? I know it's difficult to talk about post-Carolingian seigneurial times because it's that intertwined with lots of issues that we don't even imagine most of the time. But it's at this point that most of our properly Western world was molded, because it had to start solving this thing from the most elementary problems immediately to make it still something work in a broader international context. It was also quite challenging. So we find at the end of the 10th century, Otto III, so this is essentially more than 200 years after Liutprand, but we still see in Italy the public authority. Here Otto is not just king of Italy, but also Holy Roman Emperor, and the legislating, highlighting this problem, that is, the serfs apparently were difficult to keep within their own territory, especially the ecclesiastical ones, because the ecclesiastical ones were very often less coerced than the others. We've seen in the videos about Byzantine Italy and also the importance of the ecclesiastical power there that basically in places like around Rome, Ravenna, etc., the fiscal land, the demand had fallen in the hands of the church. So the church basically owned everything, right? And so naturally people would flee more easily from that land because there were just too many compared to the coercive power of the churches that also were less militarized than the secular authorities. So in part, not that the clergy was dramatically less violent than the others, than the other lords, but of course, if you are a knight by a living and you're habituated to butcher new babies without blinking an eye, while if some of your servants escapes, you just have the propensity to run after them and to cut them to pieces if they dare escape. So the church here was evidently complaining with public authority that this was an issue, etc. And so Otto III issues this. But the question is, do we find it so much else in the rest of Europe, in post-Carolingian Europe? Well, not so much, because as we've seen countless times in France, in Germany, these countries would actually increase their own degree of private power and of personal subjection and loss of freedom. As we were saying at the beginning, Germany, we think it traditionally, again, the freeman, right, the more like the barbarian egalitarian model. By high medieval times, Germany had become, exactly because there had not been a kind of a higher authority, even in the moments of peak of the same German monarchy in those times, that again, like Otto III came to live in Rome rather than in Saxony. The nobility had taken over, right? There had never been in Germany like somebody who could effectively enforce the concept that kind of everybody was free, right? Already in Longobard Italy, there was still this Roman plus this Germanic, but modern, say in fact, Romanly institutionalized and juridically enforced and administratively enforced reality for which you wanted to maintain people free. Right, and that was an enormous advantage because you would avoid, again, these abuses, these lords to emerge in a vacuum of power could even be in contrast with the king. As a consequence, the Longobard world was much less feudal than the Frankish one, and this was a negative thing from a military point of view because there was no such thing like a professional military like the one the Franks that were, albeit the exception in Europe, you must give that, were engineering. But in France, also there was no such thing like public authority. And again, after the Franks finish overexpanding, fundamentally they don't have, again, that system that prevents these lords to take over the rest of the people. The same goes with Germany, right? So traditionally, by, say, the year 1000, if you lived in Germany, unless you were a nobleman, you were somebody else's person. You belonged to somebody. You were essentially a property. By the end, in the same period, here Otto III, we are towards still the Teutonic dynasty is lasting up to the beginning of the 11th century, the Henry II. Traditionally, people were free, and not only, but they were maintaining this freedom, and even in some cases increasing it at the expense of the same nobility. As we will see now, if you wonder where the Italian communes come from, this is also the dynamic, as we will see in a while, because there is an interesting example of Nonantola near Modena in the mid 11th century, so we're just a couple of generations later, where the abbot that was lord of the local abodes promises that his justice and one of his agents will not be exercised anymore with arbitrary violence. This he explicitated in in the charter, and confirmed his people the rights enjoyed by custom in the hereditary successions of property, and of the in the usage of the uncultivated land that was left essentially open for whoever could work it, asking in turn, however, this is the negotiation, the people to maintain their let's say their duties in upkeeping the castle of Nonantola. And this is an abbot asking for it, right? So you understand, first of all, the power of the abbot in the first place, and the one they had enjoyed up to that point. But here there is a negotiation, because the people had evidently lamented here that the abbot's agents had been brutal, and had evidently prevented the people to use the uncultivated land. At this point, it was a big demographic and economical push, right? So these people were evidently expanding there, and probably these agents that worked for the abbot didn't like that, because probably they had some power in these areas as well. And the same goes for the succession of property, that evidently this man exacted something from arbitrarily as well. And what is even more striking is the final note that contemplates a penalty in case of unfulfillment both of the subjects and of the same lord, the same abbot, right? Which is a beautiful testimony of how negotiable this power was, how lordships had not been born just by oppression and imposition. They had always been about, okay, I give you something, you give me something in exchange, deal. All right. And here it is a negotiation. It's not a revolution. It's not a break of who knows what. But here, evidently, there is some shift, right? That is at this point very, very common, right? Here we are in the Po Valley, so the same areas in which fundamentally the same model have become a commune, etc. And so the power of the older aristocracy, the one of the countryside, of the rural aristocracy, the abbots, etc., but was in crisis by a certain degree, because both the city and the people that live in the countryside were kind of acquiring more power over this more traditional seigneurial forces. And this is framed in the broader picture that we have seen from Liutprand to Otto III, to almost at the threshold, basically, of the communal era, right? In the Italic kingdom, the power of the people, right? The factual power of the people, which is, again, a century after what would amaze Frederick Barbarossa and his followers, because he said, how can, say, a commoner exercise some power at some point in a lordship over a feudal aristocrat here? And the reasons here, for Italy, there are beautiful studies by the arch-famous Chris Wickham, who studied a lot, especially from a socio-economical point of view, and so that there is this bias, but it's objectively true. That there was a higher per capita wealth concentration in Italy than any other land in Europe, as well as in the world, telling the truth. And thus, the people were, on average, more powerful. Part of the reason is that, of course, Italy was a land of ancient civilization, startled public tradition, that had been maintained, as we've seen even with Liutprand, etc., in the interest of the Ottonians for Italy rather than Germany even, for all the imperial and Roman issue, etc., had made the commoners powerful enough to remain standing on their feet as freemen, right? And evolving further in creating the communes, again, that are basically created out of scratch. There was nothing there that resembled institution in the commune before it was a succession or something else, that would eventually take over the entire system. Italy was much less of a feudal land than the rest of post-Carolingian Europe, because the Franks had imported their own vassalic beneficiary system, but it had been more complicated to engineer because of the aforementioned different concentration of power, and also, urban mechanisms of how the Longobards had managed to keep functionally, devoid of larger clientele. So even the Franks creating their own fiefs in Italy had kind of less, stability as private rulers than they had in Gaul, for example, where it was normal for them to rule like that. Hence, like, the less feudal character of Italy. Not that in France or in Germany, as you know, the commune wouldn't emerge, but they wouldn't emerge with the same power they had there, and where they would take over the entire land instead. So the example of Nonantola, I think, is very, very meaningful, because it's the convergence here of the inhabitants of a same locality in defense of its own life quality, essentially, that validly contributed, together with the transformations happened in the seigneurial management of the great property, that is, what the courtly system essentially was, the seigneurial system was evolving like most of the time, to dilute the dark juridical colors of slavery, right? Creating in many areas literally a class of peasants that continued of land workers, essentially, to call themselves even by certain aspects like serfs, right? But that very often confused in a single condition that was juridically was not yet free, because nobody really, this was not a revolution. There were serfs, and it was good, right? The same freemen, the same commoners had them, right? And it was for them functional. The order was not subverted, right? But this was far, however, culturally, right, in these places, from the coercions and the real harshness of the ancient slavery, right? And so these were, in great part, even descendants of slaves who had been slaves back in the day, and many of the descendants also freemen who were working somebody else's land, like in the seigneurial system was normal. They were essentially put together. They had in common, let's say, these burdens to which they were subjected, but that also had in common this respect that the custom now somewhat ensured and even demanded from their own masters, for their own people, for their families, or for their own property, right? So this is crucial again, because this is the exact context from which eventually the same communal phenomenon would emerge. Because, and we've seen it, because in the Italian communes, even the nobility was de facto, there were some noblemen who were such because they were powerful, they were ancient feudal nobility, etc. But, you could become a miles, a knight, just if you had enough power, if you had enough money, right? Nobody cared really where you came from originally, because does it matter in a system like that? Like, if you are already powerful at that point, right? Having a war horse, an armor, weapons, knowing how to use them, it already means you are it's like today having a private yacht or a Ferrari or something. Like, you are really top, right? You are really elite, you're really rich, you're really powerful. So that, you already exercise a power of somebody else. And how you made it to the top? Well, in this sense, this exemplifies that you are, again, blessed by God in that way. So never And think even about the pride involved in this thing. I mean, even from the peasant side, right? Being able to check and balance the lordly power locally, to still be properly addressed to as a powerful community that is able to defend its own prerogatives, where can defend itself from abuses, even though you are by custom, again, historically under that lord, because you agreed that it was your own community, and maybe you can't negotiate that out, because that would really bring to the lord going at war with you. You don't want that. So that's how you measure that, because in that condition you can't afford it. In some other conditions you would afford it as well, and it would even happen at some points in Europe. But the question is, again, cooperation. That's why classist interpretations have no place, because again, this is what the actual real advantage of people stems from. Right? There is not a mechanism of oppression for which at this point we should have already exterminated everybody and everything would have crumbled. The world civilization doesn't work like that, right? Not because there are, communists, but because there are intelligent people that know how to put their intelligence, strength, and property together to make something ever more intelligent, strong, and powerful. To rule the world, to create states, to create new ideas, to expand the mind, to expand knowledge, and so on. And that's how civilization occurred, right? And again, speaking of centuries that we went by scale, those would be the also lands of humanism, the lands of modern political theory. So the fact, again, that I insist on the Italic kingdom in part also because it's better documented, but it's better documented because it was made like this, because the people could do that, right? And so they could even just document this process. And so never give for granted how impacting also the legacy of the past is on these lands, because frankly, the more I study this and the more I realize that even the connection, the disconnection from, say, the break from antiquity to medieval times is fictional in so many ways, that it's as if everybody had been kind of the same flat, dark, backward thing in medieval times from a day to another. No, it's not like that, right? Every country is different, and very different in many ways, even though the systems were similar, because they're still pre-industrial agricultural societies. There's not much else, right? But still, it's exactly because of this similarity that it's also easier to point out the difference. And the reason why this is not done is usually, again, who does even care normally in our world to study these differences and trying to understand why they matter still for our own world? This is really the big issue, in my opinion. That's why, as you know, I'm not really, every time I make this videos about social history, I say, oh my god, especially at the beginning. Then by starting to make them and learning these things myself when I make these videos, I began to say, you know what, here there is a broader picture that makes a lot of sense that nobody ever told me, and that I don't hear around. Nobody talks about this, nobody really cares. Why not talking about it? So I don't know, because even when I make these videos, at the end of the day, you see algorithmically people just click on, how peasants were defeated at the end of, not because they're much against the peasants. As you know, as you've heard, I don't have really a favorable bias towards the peasantry in general, but they were clever, as a matter of fact. But rather because people watch my social history content because they want to see how much the peasants were oppressed, right? And because they are mostly from a leftistic background, and I understand that too, because at the end of the day, you want to hear how things went, even from whichever background you are. But these mechanisms here, especially, again, as I was saying at the beginning of the video, I'm very glad I can talk about the seigneurial system in post-Carolingian Europe the way I do, because first of all, nobody talks about it. I avow that not many really watch it, but it's still this is the only channel that really talks about it. I never found it anywhere. Nobody cares, right? Let's be honest. All the other history channels, they are just clickbaiting for the cool warrior conquer thing. It's lame, right? It's for dumb kids that play video games. It's not really history. It's just it's history, but it's history without explanation, without real explanation. It's just like a brochure, like it's dépliant, and that entices you, but really doesn't leave you with much reflection without. So my rambles are perhaps annoying in many ways, but at the same time, I think they can shed more light on mechanisms that are really interesting and explain you. In fact, they're not an end to themselves. In fact, that's the thing that I can't really stand, is this fact that we have a subdivided partial history, like in just, what do you say? I just study social history, right? I just studied military history, just studied political history. It can't be like that. If you don't study all the three of them together, you can't factually understand anything about any of the three. This is instead what the Clausewitzian Trinity is fundamentally about, and that there is a reason why without a political culture or social culture, you can't fundamentally even understand war. And that's why people don't understand it today. They're just barking at something, at a pole that they think is, whatever their frustrations adjust them from right and from the left. That the thing is worth barking at, except you should realize you're not a dog but a human being. And so I presume that it's really important to even just show what history is, right? Without distortions, without ideologism, without propaganda, but just look that these things happen. We know them. We know they happen. It's not. I don't even know how you consider my content, because you see, the fact I don't talk about this, it's not because this is expert stuff, right? If you think that these topics are expert stuff, it means that you may have not ever studied what a serious medieval history manual fundamentally would tell you, right? This is just an introduction, a very lame one, telling the truth, for at least the standards have been habituated to work correctly, to topics that we know from generations at this point. I mean, historiography really wrote a lot about this stuff. So that's why also some of you makes irony by saying, very short introduction, then you talk for 2 hours. Well, yeah, because if it were for me, I would speak for 635 hours just to make a premise to the introduction, because these are such huge topics that you can't even stop talking about. And that's why, in fact, unless I die or I lose my speech or sight or whatever, I can't go on forever with this stuff. There's never a point of arrival. I can't come up with these examples to the infinite, right? It's easy, because again, I know I won't live enough to cover all, so I have absolutely no problem with going on with that. And my hope is that maybe someone can benefit from this, and so that we can't collectively benefit from this, because I presume that's the entire point. That's why I'm talking history on YouTube. It's not I'm searching for sympathies or for rating or for it's just for the money or whatever. I really do it because I think that if I disclose certain things that may seem banal to me, but maybe the world has not even cared because it's not habituated to think history in a serious fashion. This is for everybody, though, and that's what I try to do it for. Like that's, well, so my explanations are kind of, I try to be clear but also simple and making things one by one, as you see here. I think we can really improve our world in a way we've never seen before, and it may seem too late because we're messing everything up badly to the point of non-return, and we're risking seriously much worse on the shorter term. But the question is, again, can we make the difference? Yes. Like, this seems like the only way you can make the difference, I believe. Well, for today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.